Welcome everybody to this panel of the 4th International Marxist Feminist Conference with the title Feminist Strikes and New Resistances. My name is ATUTXA. I am a member of the researcher activist network Critical Theory Bilbao Barcelona, and I will be the moderator during this session. I have just been listening one of the previous panels about the feminist, anti-racist class struggles of women in Andalusia. And I feel it is a crucial dialogue that this panel is bringing by resituating the Marxist feminist thought, this time in the north of Europe. So I'm quite excited to see those kind of breaches happening. Right, so let's introduce the panelists in the order of presentations. DESIRÉE ENLUND is a human geographer working at Linköping University. She defended the thesis Contentious Countrysides, Social Movements Reworking and Resisting Public Healthcare Restructuring in Rural Sweden in 2020 at Umeå University. The thesis received the 2020 Rudolf Meidner Award from the Swedish Labour Movement's Archives and Library. The thesis studies the restructuring of the public healthcare system from the 1990s onwards through 2 cases of social movements and cooperatives organizing against the consequences of this restructuring in rural areas. Today, she will be, if I'm not mistaken, she will be developing some of the conclusions of her dissertation. Ella Petrini will come next. Ella is a sociologist particularly interested in labor, social movements, and the sociology of emotions. After graduating from her master's degree in sociology at Gothenburg University, she has worked as a research assistant at KU Leuven in a research project on the relationship between unpaid work and precariousness in care and creative work. Ella is also engaged in the activist organization Gig Watch, which investigates the gig economy in Sweden. Finally, VALGERÐUR and Eva will present together. VALGERÐUR PÁLMADÓTTIR is a historian of ideas and intellectual historian with a special interest in the history of political ideas and theories, and also ideas and practices of social movements, particularly feminism. She received her PhD in the history of ideas at the University of Umeå in Sweden in 2018, with the thesis, The Perplexities of the Personal and the Political, How Women's Liberation Became Women's Human Rights. She's currently affiliated with the Department of History and Philosophy at the University of Iceland as a postdoc researcher, and her ongoing research project focuses on the one-day women's general strikes in Iceland. Finally, Eva SCHMITZ is a senior sociologist. Her focus throughout her adult life has been women's organizing and mobilization. She has done research on women's role in the trade union movement with a special focus on female workers' participation in strikes. She has also focused on women's questions and organizing in the First, Second, and Third International. She has done this research both from inside the academy and outside as a member of the women's liberation movement and in the Socialist Party in the 70s and 80s. After her bachelor's degree in sociology, she worked as a youth caregiver and telephone feeder for 25 years. She went back to sociology and obtained her doctoral degree in 2007 with the dissertation Sisterhood as a Political Action, Women's Organizing from 1968 until 1982 in Sweden. She has been a lecturer in sociology until her retirement. This is all from me now. DESIRÉE, the floor is yours. You can activate your video and microphone, and your turn.
Thank you for that introduction. Okay, so here's my PowerPoint. Great. So as IBAI said, I'm a PhD in human geography working with feminist geography. And I'm currently working at the Department of Thematic Studies at the Gender Studies unit at Linköping University. But I will be presenting here my research from my doctoral degree that was in Umeå So next. So my dissertation, my thesis is based on interviews I did with different activists and the members of cooperatives in 2 different cases. And the goal with my thesis was to investigate the changing conditions for Swedish healthcare in rural and sparsely populated areas. And in addition, I wanted to explore the different forms of collective action that people engage in order to maintain healthcare where they live when the welfare state withdraws it. So that is why I studied 2 different cases where citizens have both protested but also organized their own healthcare. So my first case study was the cooperative healthcare center called HÄLSORUM Offerdal, which opened in the region of Jämtland in 1992. And this is a cooperative that exists in a very small town, but with quite a large surrounding area that it services. And the second case was protests against cutbacks and the closures of both the emergency wards and the delivery ward at the local hospital in a town called Sollefteå. So this is a bit of a bigger place. And these protests started in 2015. Next. So since I don't expect you to know exactly where this is, here you can see a map of these areas that I studied. So this yellow area is in the middle. There is the hospital that closed in Sollefteå, or where the entire hospital didn't close, but several wards were closed, the emergency wards and the delivery ward where you go to have your baby, to deliver your baby. And the other green area is where this cooperative in this town called Krokom, that's pretty much where this cooperative, the first case study was located. So it's quite north of, I mean, it is in the middle of Sweden on the map, but if Stockholm is the center, this is quite far out in the periphery, quite far from, from what people consider to be the central part of Sweden. So next. So in order for you to understand these protests, I need to give you some type of context of the transformation of Swedish healthcare, public healthcare over the past 30 years. So since the 1990s, there has been a process of both marketization and privatization of the welfare system. And for the public healthcare, this means that public healthcare providers or primary care centers mostly operate under market-like conditions. And in the privatization has mostly, privatization is most in the primary care, where almost 40% is produced by private for-profit companies. But it's much less so for specialized care, as you can see here. So the care that you get in a hospital is only around 7% privatized. And when I talk about privatization in Swedish healthcare, I mean 2 very special things that might not look the same in your countries. But the first, it is that privatization only applies to the production of healthcare. The funding is still done through the taxes, so the funding is still public. And the second thing is that private healthcare is produced by for-profit companies. Private production that is non-profit is almost non-existent. It makes up around 1% of the total healthcare cost in Sweden. So private production of healthcare in Sweden is a very particular thing. It is funded by the state or funded through our taxes, but it is produced by for-profit companies. And this type of privatization has been ongoing since the 1990s. But one of the crucial points in this process was in 2009, when the primary patient choice care reform was implemented. And this introduced a market system with 2 important aspects for especially rural areas. And first, it is that healthcare companies wanting to open a primary care center must meet the predetermined requirements of the different regions. But when they do so, they can open, and the regions that are in charge of distributing healthcare and providing healthcare, so the public, they still need to finance it. So as long as a private company you fulfill these requirements, and then you are, then you have a right to open. But the funding, of course, comes from the public. And the second aspect is that there is a clause in this law saying that there is a right of establishment, and this gives private companies the freedom to open a primary care center wherever they want to do it. So the region that is responsible for distribution and redistribution cannot influence where these locational decisions. But if I want to open a primary care next to another private primary care in a very affluent area, the region cannot say no to this. But I'm entitled to do this. So there's no need. There's no private companies are not obliged to sort of provide healthcare where it's most needed, but they can choose where it's more profitable to do this. At the same time, the regions in this sort of pseudo market, the regions are responsible to provide equal access to healthcare across the entire country and for their particular regions. So together, these two aspects then have led to a concentration of private primary care in very affluent urban areas that already had good access to healthcare and have had so for a long time. But here there is financial incentives to open private healthcare. And at the same time, the regions and the public then still needs to provide for rural areas, but just after they have already paid the cost of the private primary care centers that are then located in the income generating areas. So within this sort of context of the market and the private provision, my two case studies are located in areas that are usually not serviced by private healthcare centers. But because there's no income really to make here, so there's too few people living here, they live too far apart, and generally they also have a higher care need, so they cost more. So in these two areas, these two cases I studied, there is not a lot of private healthcare. Next. And I was also saying that in one of the cases, the protests were around the delivery care, so delivery wards and where to deliver your baby. And unfortunately, I don't have a map of this primary care, how that is distributed over the country. It's too complex, but to illustrate how this looks, I at least have this map of the delivery wards in the Nordic region from 2016. So this was before this second case where the delivery ward was closed down. But here you can see that the areas, large parts of northern Sweden and away from the coast, but also northern Finland there's large areas where there are no hospitals where you can deliver your babies, while Norway seemed to have a bit more of an even distribution. And in the south of Sweden, there's also fairly lots of delivery wards. And why I show this map is also because to a large extent, emergency care and the delivery care are interconnected. So this map shows delivery wards, but this also means that there is emergency care in these hospitals. Because to have a functioning delivery ward, you also need to have emergency care in case something happens during delivery. So this is sort of a map also of emergency, where you can access emergency care if you have a car accident or something similar to this. Next. So my thesis sort of provides a kind of timeline of privatization and its consequences in rural Sweden, but also how discourses about public healthcare has changed over time. And the first cooperative that you can see here on the map, Hälsorum Offerdal, they started in '92 after the regional health authorities said they wanted to close the public primary care center there. And then the workers at this primary care center thought that couldn't we do it better ourselves? And they actually started a process where they were, where the workers were discussing with the authorities, and they took over the primary care from the public health authorities and turned it into a workers' cooperative. And in this process then in the 90s, they actually received quite a lot of help from the region in doing this from the public health authorities, because the public health authorities were quite interested in seeing what this type of experiment could, with alternative delivery of care, what that actually could do and how that could look. And so they were helped quite a lot here by the public. And despite this initial interest, the cooperative still faced a lot of risks and a lot of problems over the next 10 to 15 years, when the region at several occasions wanted to cut the contract with them and other types of risks. And in the mid 2000s, they had quite a hard time. A lot of members had actually retired, and the economy had also become increasingly difficult. And this situation was becoming increasingly urgent when this patient choice care reform was going to be implemented within the next few years. So to find a solution to these economic problems and the problem of decreasing membership, they turned to the community to see if they were interested in helping the cooperative to survive. And this was the beginning of a sort of second transformation into a citizen-owned cooperative, where the primary care was owned by some 600 members of the community. And although this second transformation provided a solution to the urgent acute problems, the problem of this increasingly difficult economic situation remained, as funding from the public healthcare authorities has steadily declined over the years. So they still needed to find more solutions. And the one solution that they then came up with a few years later was that they actually participated, the cooperative participated in the public procurement of an occupational healthcare for a municipality in this region, and then they won it. So when they started this occupational healthcare center, they sort of created a second pillar on which they could sort of have the cooperative stand. And this has financially helped the cooperative and kept it afloat. And this year, the cooperative actually celebrates 30 years of existence. Next. And the second case is quite different then. So this is demonstrations and protests around this closing of the delivery and emergency wards. And these protests started quite long after this first cooperative started. They started in 2015. And then in this case, it was that the public healthcare authorities had started discussing closing these different wards at the local hospital in order to save money. And this sparked a wave of protest across several of these small cities in this region that rely on this hospital for their care. And first it was announced that there was going to be cutbacks on 2 different hospitals. And then quite a spontaneous demonstration, the one on the picture here that you see, was started, where they sort of, or this was organized, and they said, without the delivery ward, this town called Övik sort of stops functioning. And this was in September 2015. And a few weeks later, the protests continued, and a few weeks later, a second demonstration was organized in a neighboring town, and then it was under a sort of a different slogan. And this second demonstration led to some changes in regional policy. Some politicians had to step down, and there was some reorganizing of some things. And they also promised that they were going to look into this savings plan again, that they were going to go back and see if this was really doable, or maybe they needed to change it in some way. But despite these promises, nothing really happened. And some 6 months later, they organized a third demonstration in another town. And this, the organizers here actually claimed that this was the largest demonstration in this area's history, and that there was some 20,000 people participating in this demonstration. And that would mean, I think it was maybe 1/3 or half of this town where the demonstration was held. If there was 20,000 participants, that would mean it was 1/3 or half of the population participating. So despite these intense protests, the region continued its plans to save and cut back. And 1 year into these protests, they sort of changed character when one group decided that they were going to occupy the hospital. Ah, yeah, next. I forgot, sorry. So they decided to occupy the entrance to the hospital one night in January 2017. And as this quote from one of the people I interviewed, Daniel, said, it was that the delivery ward was the symbolic issue, even though they defended the whole hospital. So, but they didn't go in and actually occupy the delivery ward itself, but they stayed in the entrance so that the hospital could continue functioning. And this occupations are not so common in Sweden, so this was quite a special event. And this occupation attracted a lot of attention, and a lot of politicians and activists from all around the country actually started coming and visiting this occupation over the first few months. And then around the same time as this occupation started, another group of activists decided to actually open a cooperative primary care center that was going to be owned by the local community, so a citizen cooperative. And this is maybe where these two cases actually connect, because while the first case started with the cooperative taking over primary care as a cooperative, in the second case, the protest sort of led to the start of a cooperative. And this opened in December 2017 and were built on the protests. And in a way, it was a form of exploiting this patient choice care reform by using this obligation to accept private primary care centers as long as they meet the region's requirements. Next. And through this organization, I mean, so by organizing this, it was sort of organizing something against the will of the public healthcare authorities, because people felt that they were not listened to anyway. So then they had protested these cutbacks, but nothing happened. And then they could sort of use the law in this case to sort of do something that the region didn't want them to do. So, so they used this freedom of choice law, the patient choice care reform, that is quite a neoliberal law, to sort of open the cooperative and own the primary care together. But at the same time, this same law was sort of what also broke this cooperative down, because after less than a year, the cooperative went bankrupt due to financial problems, and they had to close. And partly this bankruptcy was because of the way that this financing model of the public healthcare authority looks, the one that makes it more profitable to locate primary cares in private primary cares in affluent areas and not in poor areas. So it was sort of double-edged sword to use this patient choice care reform. And before the bankruptcy, the cooperative asked the region for help with this economic situation, but the answer from the public healthcare authorities was that they couldn't do anything because it would create unequal conditions in the market. So even though the cooperative had taken over some of the public healthcare authorities' responsibility for providing equal care, they still didn't receive any thanks for this, but had to, had to close down. And unlike the first cooperative that has survived for 30 years, they did not have time to sort of adapt to this economic situation over the course of the years, but it was a much more abrupt and abrupt start and abrupt end. So yeah, I think I want to finish off there. So thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Desirée. I mean, it's been quite an interesting start to this panel in this kind of interaction between state, community, private ownership, also between the tensions between center and periphery. I feel that all those kind of coordinates were very interesting. So thanks for this great beginning for this panel. Let's give the floor now to Ella. Ella, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you. Yes, so my name is Ella, and I will present here a paper that I wrote together with Åsa Wettergren, who's a professor at Gothenburg University. And it's based on research I did as a master's student as part of my thesis. And the title of the presentation is Organizing Outsourced Workers in UK's New Trade Unionism, Emotions, Protest, and Collective Identity. And in this presentation, I will speak about the union-led movement against outsourcing. So the situation where large parts of the workforce are hired by subcontractors. And the role, and I will speak especially about the role of emotion in this protest wave in the UK. And I will draw on the literature of social movements and emotions. And thereby, I hope this presentation will address non-material issues and the fight for dignity and labor movements, and to kind of go beyond the somewhat cognitivist approach of most labor movement research. Next. And this is nicely illustrated in this quote by union organizer and scholar Jane McLevy, who says, "Scholars assume that material gain is a primary concern of unions, missing that workplace fights are about one of the deepest human emotional needs, dignity." Next. And then, yeah, so there's been this divide between culturally oriented new social movements and old structure-based labor movements. So while labor movements have been among the most powerful social movements in history, the rise of new social movement theory in the 1970s created this distinction around movements organized around material conditions and movements focused on transforming culture. And in consequence, unions are often seen to operate outside the realm of culture and emotion. And alongside this rise of the new social movements and social movement theory, we saw a decline in militancy and mobilizing power of labor movements in the industrialized countries in the global north. And this has been critiqued a lot, talking about the political embeddedness of unions, their organizational slowness or inertia, their bureaucratic rigidness, and so on. Some social movement theorists have even assumed that class divisions have become somehow less significant for collective action. this has been questioned, among others, by Beverly Silvers, who pointed out that this is not a global trend, and that labor movements in the global South have been relatively vital and often engage in more combative action. And the concept social movement unionism denotes trade union militancy in, for example, the Philippines, South Africa, and Brazil. And labor movements in these post-colonial contexts fought not only for improved working conditions, but also for citizen and democratic rights. At the same time, institutionalized unions in the global North have defined working class rights and who has access to those rights in ways that excluded migrants, non-white, and female workers from class identity and solidarity. And in the UK specifically, many other countries too, but yeah, there's been a very large decline in union membership, and also there's been a deterioration of internal democratic structures of British unions. And this is seen, for example, in a tendency to favor employer partnership deals that have little transparency to the members over grassroots organizing. But in recent years, there's been a revival of social movements and community unionism in the UK. And examples of this is the growth of grassroots unions like the United Voices of the World. Oh, wait. Oh, sorry. Can we have the next slide? Yes. And the Independent Workers Union of Great Britain, IWGB. And both these unions are led by migrant and Black, Asian, and minority ethnic workers. And they have grown stronger over the years. And now I will go into some of their campaigns. So yeah, next slide. So since the beginning of the early 2000s, there's been campaigns against outsourcing at universities in the UK. And what started as mainly cleaners organizing for living wages have become generalized to include all outsourced workers, with workers raising demands to effectively end outsourcing and to be hired directly by the universities or other public institutions. These campaigns are part of a transnational chain of action against outsourcing that can be dated back to the Justice for Janitors campaigns in LA in the 90s. And in the UK, universities have become important battlegrounds for the fight against outsourcing, but there's also campaigns like in other public sector institutions and in private companies. And the grassroots unions, the IWGB, the GVW, are leading these movements. And they are focused on workers' self-organizing and draw a lot on social movement tactics like public demonstrations, direct action, social media, and legal activism, in addition to industrial action. Meanwhile, the role of Unison, which is the largest labor union in the UK that organizes public service workers, has been a bit more ambiguous. There are several Unison branches that have campaigned for the living wage and to end outsourcing. And often at the branch or grassroots levels, there are a lot of connections between Unison and these smaller unions. But in some cases, Unison branches have been very passive or even try to undermine organizing efforts of outsourced workers. And it's against this backdrop that UVW and IWGB construct their collective identity and their movement culture. So it's very important for these unions to claim that they're different from Unison and other larger institutionalized unions. And by doing so, they attract members who have grown disillusioned with the established labor movements. And the background of this is often how precarious and migrant workers have been dismissed as difficult to organize. But these campaigns are proving those narratives wrong. Next. Yes, so the theoretical framework that I'm working with here is, yeah, so after there's been a more and more questioning of the dialectical link between social identity and interests, but also material grievances and collective action. And it's been pointed out that appropriate material conditions don't always trigger class action. And instead, social movement scholars have highlighted the role of movement culture, the collective process whereby people make sense of grievances as socially produced and political, creating shared interpretations of structural issues. And Rick Fantasia has pointed out that collective action needs both an identification of shared interests, but also an identification with the collective identity. And our argument is that emotion contributes to both these processes. And to the case of unionism, we believe that the theory developed by Jack Barbalet, that's emotion is embedded in and emerges from structural relations, and that emotion motivates and drives action, and that when individuals share the same emotional experiences due to a shared social position, this can like a collective identification and articulation of conflict. And yeah, so it also suggests that class antagonism relies not only on class consciousness, but also needs like an effective source, class resentment, which Barbalet describes as an emotional reaction to unequal distribution of material resources and power. And this kind of illustrates how emotion, which is non-material, and interests, material, are interconnected and dependent, motivators for collective action. And also emotion like indignation, anger, and outrage are very important to articulate social conflict. But also emotion functions as a form of glue to friendship and trust and solidarity. And here we build on the notion of political solidarity, which arises from Sally Schultz. And political solidarity emerges from situation of injustice and oppression and adopts an antagonistic stance to power. Yes. And next. And this the material for this paper is based on interviews and fieldwork that I did in London in 2019. So 11 interviews with union activists, representatives and organizers, and also participant observation at different protest events and meetings, as well as like social events kind of going on in these campaigns. And it's also complemented by media material from the campaigns. Yeah, next. Next, yes, thank you. Okay, yeah, and I will now talk a little about how the informants kind of distinguish between the cultural aspects of the new grassroots unions and what they often encountered in their meetings with Unitim. Yeah, so first there's a difference in like the action repertoires. So whereas the smaller unions draw a lot on social movement tactics, as I said, a lot of direct action combined with strikes, occupations, media campaigns, often like Unitim's approach is more based on union recognition deals with management, of both the university and the private companies, the subcontractors. And also negotiations often going on behind closed doors. And this kind of shapes how the informants see the unions. Unison is often described as taking sides with the employer, so like not representing the workers, but siding with the employer, as being also passive and slow and bureaucratic, like not taking action. Whereas the smaller unions are described by the informants as being combative and confrontational, being bold and nimble, and their actions are described as very energetic, joyous, even carnivalesque, fun. And there's also a difference in how the unions relate to like a broader movement, where the smaller unions are like very reliant on an activist base and trying to involve external supporters, like both community organizations, students, different activists from the broader left. And the unison branches have often been a bit more cautious about involving supporters. Yeah, next. Yeah, here's a poster from United Voices of the World, one of these unions. It says up here on the top, we're a grassroots member-led fighting trade union. We're founded by and for low-paid migrant workers. We're a community. And then, yeah, the slogan "No longer invisible" is very common also in the campaigns. And here you also see like the blend of immaterial demands like dignity and respect with material demands, living wage and sick pay. And this brings us over to the identification of collective identity. So next slide. Yeah, so in the campaigns, outsourcing is, the informants talk about a movement to end outsourcing. And there's a strong focus on migrants, Black, Asian, and minority ethnic workers. And informants both like talk about outsourcing as a practice of exploitation, expressing class consciousness, but also as talk about outsourcing as a form of discrimination and exclusion, as a form of racism kind of in itself. Referring to a very strict racial division of labor between, and also segregation between outsourced and in-house workers. And they also address how the status of second-class citizen and second-class workers strengthen each other. So race and class are very clearly interwoven in the articulation of that collective identity. And the movement is then, as one informant said, recentering who is a worker, broadening the political identity of working class struggles in the UK. And UW and IWGB, as we saw in the last slide, describe themselves as mainly organizing precarious migrant workers. And this is a way to signal their identity and to demarcate from the established unions. And a common slogan in the campaigns is "Migrant workers push wages up," which is a challenge to the racist narratives of migrant workers as pushing wages down. And this is an example of how a stigmatizing identity become a site of struggle and source of pride. Yeah, next. Yeah, so over to how emotion aids the identification of shared interests. And non-material and emotional needs like dignity, respect, and visibility are very important and at the forefront in the campaigns against outsourcing, and very central to the collective identity. And going back to the argument that emotions emerge from social structures, we argue that there's a specific the specific situation of outsourcing give rise to strong and shared emotions that can become mobilizing. And the workers describe like how non-material values are transmitted in the working conditions that are present in outsourcing. For example, like lack of respect, dignity, and care for workers is communicated in things like not having the right equipment, inadequate uniforms, creating feelings of being uncomfortable, cold, and exposed. The workers also speak a lot about being invisible and being excluded, and it's often described as being left outside. And exclusion is both like about being scheduled on social hours, or that scheduling practices separate workers, and also like things like not having access to the regular staff room or staff parking. And there's also a very far reaching like disregard for outsourced workers' health, and like lack of sick leave benefits lead many people to have to work sick. And this can be like thought of as this creates very strong feeling of being humiliated. And there's this concept of humiliating mechanisms by Dennis Smith, and it's described as being violently pushed down or forcibly kept below the boundary line that separates the worthy from the unworthy. And outsourcing is kind of seen as this boundary line. And this is one example of this is from a speech by cleaner and union activists, who says that we need to end this discrimination between those who count and those who don't count at all. And not only are there exclusionary practices like in outsourcing, but outsourced workers are often also excluded from the union, like not being heard or listened to, or told like we will deal with this later, often in the situation of outsourcing is like, since unions are more focused on the in-house employees, and you see like they don't have the connection with the subcontractors. Workers often perceive like that the union didn't care about the outsourced workers and their conditions. And this inaction from the union contributes kind of to a normalization of the working conditions. Next slide. But emotion is also a motivator for action. In the previous slides, like the situation described there leads to very strong feelings of class resentment and anger, but this doesn't always have to lead to collective action. It can also be very isolating, especially in the context of outsourcing that tends to separate workers. Sharing these emotions and experiences lead to identification and solidarity that can help to realize individual oppression as a result of structural and social processes. This is described by one of the informants, Julio, and he talks about how they were very afraid before the campaign started, but also saw like unionization and organizing as a way to overcome fear. And it says like that the main thing to embolden people was the opportunity to say how we're feeling and what.
Sorry, Ella.
Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry to scare you like this. I was just making sure that you saw my sign saying that your time is up.
Okay, yeah, sorry.
Yes.
Well, yeah.
That's it.
So, yeah. Okay. Yeah, I will wrap it up. Next slide. Yeah. And so, like, emotion is also like manifested in collective action, and direct action, in contrast to like the more institutional routes to raise collective grievance in the workplace, allows for a broader participation, and also to be more confrontational and to express anger at one's working situation. So yeah, this is a very important part of why the campaigns are successful, and also like why many workers are leaving Unison for the smaller unions. Yeah. So next. Yeah. So the main argument here is that emotion is embedded in the social structures, and that emotion have a strong mobilizing power in labor structures, and that yeah, there's both immaterial claims of dignity, respect, and care, but also material claims of working conditions and rights are important in labor struggles. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Ella. It's been quite an interesting talk that you just gave us. I feel that it was very interesting to see this idea of community unionism building their own identity and identification against big institutionalized unions, and how there's this kind of chain reaction between identity building, interest, emotion, and class antagonism. I feel that there is a lot of dialogues that we can already start thinking between the talks that we just had. Okay, so now is the time of our last panelists. VALGERÐUR and Eva, the floor is yours.
I think, Vala, you will start.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes. So we have this joint presentation, and we are going to present two strikes. They are both, these are historical cases. So it is the Women's Day Off strike, one day symbolic strike that took place in Iceland in 1975. And then Eva is going to talk about the cleaning strike that broke out in Sweden in 1974. And we're going to talk about their legacies, notions of solidarity they enhanced, and the relations between women's struggle and class struggle that appeared in that context. Next slide, please. Yeah, here's we have a small description of the two kinds of strike. One, the SAAB cleaning strike was directed towards workplaces, and one company in particular, the International Cleaning Association, ESS from Denmark, that had then taken over quite much of the cleaning business in many countries. That strike lasted for weeks, and thus more in line with the traditional use of the concept and method of a strike, while the Women's Day Off was, like I said, it was a more of a symbolic use of the strike method, where women refrained from all kinds of work for one single day with the aim of raising consciousness about women's situation. So I give the floor to Eva now, and then I will take over.
Okay, thank you, Vala. And I can take the next slide. Okay, so I will talk about this historical strike that took place in Sweden at the end of 1974 by cleaners. And though this strike was about 50 years ago, but when I give you the story of this strike, we find many similarities and from what's going on today, their demands and so on different strikes all over the world. When female cleaners in Sweden went on strike at several workplaces in 1974, it was a continuation from last century of class struggle among thousands and thousands of female industrial workers. The demands were much the same: higher wages, better working conditions, and be treated as a human being. The cleaner strike occurred during the rising of the women's movement throughout the country and a period of extensive class struggle, mostly in male-dominated factories. Next. The cleaners at the steel plant in Borlänge started the struggle after a long period of dissatisfaction on how they were treated by their company, ASAB. When they urged their union representative to negotiate about higher salary, they were met with sneer and the words, "If you think you are paid that bad, I think you should quit the job." And that was the drop. And the female asked him, "What side are you on?" The cleaners understood that they had to rely on their own organizing and started a local trade union club, organized a collection of signatures from every ASAB cleaner in Borlänge with the demand 5 krona per hour and handed over to their union. While waiting for a response, the union called for a meeting and actions were discussed among the workers. They had read in the paper that cleaning workers in both Norway and UK had been on successful strikes for higher wages, and they thought, if they can strike in Norway, then so can we. The 80 cleaners did not accept the negotiations and went on strike. They got immediate support and economic solidarity from the male steel workers, urging them not to go back and not to give up. The independent women's group in town took also contact with the cleaners to organize collections in downtown. That resulted in a call from the local union of the steel workers, who threatened to cancel economic support if they did not stop all contact with this women's group. The cleaners responded that they decide themselves whose support they will accept and did not let themselves be threatened. The strike got an enormous attention in all news. This was the first women's strike since the 30s. Suddenly, these women who were kept in silence, isolated at the workplace, were in the front news all over and talking about their economic and social situation. Next. The union did not know what to do with these women. They urged them to go back to work. It was an illegal strike due to the Collective Bargaining Act. And they said they had to wait for the new negotiations. But the cleaners responded, they will not go back to work until all their demands were met. Every day they held strike meetings and understood the importance to stick together, be united, and support those women who felt a lot of stress due to the strike. It was a challenge of their role. The workforce consisted also of female workers, and at the meetings, a female interpreter were invited. The strike was about to end after a week, though their demands were not completely met. But a call from an ASAB cleaner up in north in the minefields late Sunday evening changed this. She said that tomorrow they will go out in solidarity strike for them. That made a confidence for the cleaners striking in Borlänge, who we see at this picture. And they decided to strike and continue the strike. But after one day, ASA backed and accepted the cleaners' strike, the cleaners' demands. Next. In the mines, the strike immediately spread to all mines and about 150 women went on strike and also demanding higher wages, better working conditions. These women had no experience of union struggle, but they learned from the mines who had been out in a strike 5 years earlier. They organized themselves in strike committees and regularly called to large meetings where all decisions about the strike were taken. Next. And here also we see a demonstration by the cleaners and with support with the miners. The cleaners got support from the miners' union, both economically and backed up against strike breakers. The union flew back and forth from Stockholm, urging them to go back, but the women responded, "The gentlemen in Stockholm can sit and talk. The strike will continue until we get our demands through." Next. The strike took another turn when a group of 12 ASAP cleaners went out in a strike at a hotel in the small town of Skövde, in solidarity with the women in North, as well as 5 krona more per hour. Immediately, the bosses used the anti-strike law and expelled the 2 women who were trade unionists, and after a few weeks later, the rest of the women were also fired. In the mines, the dirt grew in dining rooms, toilets, showers, all showed in newspaper. The whole mine production was threatened and the safety for the miners could not be guaranteed. After 4 weeks, the company of the miners, LKAB, interfered in the strike and forced ASAP to accept the women's demand and guaranteed the extra payment. ASAP probably thought the strike among the cleaners were not over, but they did not expect the strong class consciousness among some of the female workers. The struggle continued, now with the demands. Next. And it says here, acquit and re-employing all fired Skövde cleaners. And this banner is held by the three cleaners from the north who now went on again out in a strike, and that was the turning of a new solidarity strike for these women. And they said, "We will not return to work until the girls in Skövde are rehired. The labor court will not succeed in condemning us to silence." Next. The strike was followed by cleaners at different workplaces in Umeå and at Arlanda. Next. We will see the pictures also here from the Arlanda airport. But the solidarity had also to reach broader. The dock workers from Gothenburg, the biggest port, took the initiative and organized the first solidarity meeting. The community house was packed, many did not get in, and in the front sat the fired Skövde cleaners. After this, the solidarity groups were formed all over, meetings were organized, often by a women's group, and the striking cleaners were the main speakers. The end of this struggle was settled when the cleaners from Skövde were in labor court in April 1975. The judgment ruled that 2 of the former unionists were not strike leaders, and it was wrong for ASAP to fire them. They got jobs back. ASAP were forced to pay both damages and lost wages. On the other hand, the court ruled that ASAP had the right to fire the other 10 cleaners as it was an illegal strike. However, the next day, ASAP declared in the TV news that all dismissed cleaners were offered re-employment. The opinion for the cleaners' right had become so large throughout Sweden that ASAP felt compelled to rehire them all. And this could not be expressed better by one of the Skövde cleaners. She said, "We did not win anything in the labor court, but on the other hand, we won something that is very substantial, an awareness and solidarity, and that is fantastic." And I think this quote from her also summarized much of what this strike was about. And I will now also present some other aspects, summarize aspects of the strike. A few years earlier, Group 8, the biggest organization in the women's movement, organized public meetings and the first women demonstration through the streets of London with demands where they demanded high wages and better conditions for women who worked part-time. No other organization, neither the union or a women's organization, other women's organization, mobilized women by this time. A slogan of Group 8 was, no women's struggle without class struggle, no class struggle without women's struggle. And how does this slogan relate to the cleaner strike? The struggle for economic independence is a central demand for women's emancipation. A wage to be able to support herself and her children has been demanded by female workers since their entrance in the labor market. Met with resistance from their bosses, the strike became a necessary weapon against the capital during those years, a struggle that often led to victory. During the strike, women got more and more awareness of their subordinate position as a woman and the low value of the workforce. These women were at the bottom of the labor market hierarchy, stood up brave and strong against their bosses and demanded a change. They said, it is important that we women also receive a salary. We shall not ask our men for every penny, but able to support ourselves. With the strike, the cleaners also challenged the expected traditional role of women in the society, and the feminist consciousness was developed. Though they would not define themselves as feminists, they expressed, it was a women's fight. The status for us were a bit half crazy, half dull women who weren't to be reckoned with in the labor market. And then we struggled. I don't think they expected us to stand up for our rights. The female workers had no connection with the women's movement before the strike. Many of them could not see how their interests were shared. But the cleaners soon found them as as important allies. Women activists organized support work, their union did not. Next. And we skip this one, we take the next one. The female cleaners were suddenly main speaker at International Women's Day in several towns. Now they became part of the ongoing general women's struggle. The strike changed in many ways the life of these women. One of the most popular curses from the women's movement was that girls, we must raise our voices to be heard. And now this was done by the cleaners. The confrontation with the capital has several aspects. The importance of the work became suddenly visible when the production in the mines was threatened. For a period, it became apparent what power the women's collective had, and they eventually forced concessions from the capital. The strike was also about the notorious anti-strike law. The Employers Association tried to end the wave of wild strikes and issued directive to local employers to stop them from raising wages in the event of a wild strike. They also urged its members to report the striking workers to the employment tribunal. The first workers group to be attacked and registered at labor court were the most vulnerable workers, the hotel cleaners in Skövde. And SAF had not anticipated the enormous solidarity for the cleaners. It became an intense class struggle as well as a women's solidarity struggle. As the women said, for us or for ASAB, there can be no work peace until the cleaners go back to the work. The enormous solidarity was also beyond the control of the labor union organizations, who were trapped in that role of legal actor in its political and economic negotiation system, while the cleaners fought and considered it as a class law. Throughout the strike, there was a strong distrust of their own trade union, where the cleaners asked themselves which side in the class conflict they represent. The strike also exposed that the talk and act for gender equality in the trade union still had a long way to go. The cleaners were met with patriarchal attitudes. They were still not regarded as equal comrades. So I summarize. Instead, the cleaners organized themselves independently in their united female collective They got the strength and courage to stand up against attacks from the bosses. The strike was a class struggle where they took the initiative to struggle against exploitation of the workforce, as well as they showed a way forward for other low-paid women. At the end of the strike, they said, "I believe that the strike has woken many other women who got to low-wage jobs, such as daycare workers, home visitors. And today, 50 years later, for example, here in Sweden, daycare workers, assistant nurses, and now midwives take up the struggle for higher wages and better working conditions." Thanks. Now I leave it to Vala.
Yes, thank you, Eva. So I will introduce or describe the Icelandic Women's Day Off, or what has alternatively been called the Icelandic Women's Strike. So the idea of performing a one-day women's strike that would unite all women, regardless of occupation, or if they primarily worked outside or inside the home, came from the women's liberation group, the Red Stockings, which had been established in 1970. Most of the active members in the group were not unskilled workers, but were to a great extent educated and worked as journalists, teachers, or artists, similarly as in the new women's liberation groups around the Nordic region, for example, Group 8 in Sweden that Eva has mentioned. However, these predominantly middle-class women's liberationists sought to make allegiance with women workers from the lower strata in Iceland, as well as in Sweden, as Eva has discussed. And this happened especially in Iceland after the Red Stockings' political turn in 1974, when they adopted a line that drew direct lines between women's struggle with class struggle, similarly as Group 8 in Sweden. And this allegiance building with women workers, non-skilled women workers, became a concrete way for the Red Stockings to live up to their ideological conviction that the women's struggle was neither viable nor credible without a class struggle. And no class struggle was meaningful without a clear conception of women's liberation. Notably, one of the most prominent members of the Red Stockings, Vilborg Harðardóttir, who was a journalist working for the leftist newspaper The People's Will, held out a weekly section in the paper called The Equality Pages. There she discussed pressing feminist issues of the day. And for example, she reported extensively on the cleaning women's strike in Sweden and the proceedings of the court case, that labor court case that Eva described. Harðardóttir maintained that the common verdict in the court case between ASAB, the company, and the striking women in Skövde would be the most important verdict of the International Women's Year. This happened in 1975, which is the United Nations International Women's Year. And this is what she's referring to. Thus, Vilborg Harðardóttir presented the cleaning strike in Sweden as a highly relevant case for feminism internationally, in which questions of class and gender intersected. And this was more of a side story of the connections between these strikes, perhaps. But similarly, as for their Nordic equivalents, the Red Stockings in Iceland put great emphasis on the question of women's work and economic independence. They highlighted the unfairness in the fact that women worked a double shift, and that housework was neither respected as work experience when and if they entered wage labor outside of the home, nor was it economically valued for its own sake. And so the idea of a general women's strike had come up in the Red Stockings meetings every once in a while since the 1970s. But the wheels started turning during a conference they organized together with women's unions about women's low wages in January 1975. And this is a picture taken from that conference. The fact is that labor unions were gender separated in Iceland at that time. And as such, they reflected also how the labor market was highly gender segregated. Yeah, but anyway, this conference on women's low wages, these groups together, the representatives of the women unions and the Red Stockings, decided to jointly pursue the idea of a women's strike and organize it so that it will take place. And directly after this meeting, a critique of the plans of a general women's strike that would unite women from all classes came from the male-dominated radical left in Iceland. In an anonymous article covering the above-mentioned meeting in a paper called The Class Struggle, which was the mouthpiece of the Communist Party, which was a minor political party in Iceland, has never been a part of the government. But in the article, the speakers at the meeting were said to have shown little signs of class solidarity, since the article author says most of them were occupied with questions concerning women's rights and supposedly directed their complaints at men in general. And the article criticizes the idea about general solidarity among women across classes because, quote, this would be to twist things in a wrong angle, because women's subordination is not first and foremost caused by the existence of man, similarly as men do not constitute any particular class by themselves. On the contrary, all society is divided into classes and both sexes are part of all classes, end of quote. Thus, the article rejects the idea of a general women's strike on the grounds that it would egg working class women against working class men and would in the end benefit none other than the employers. Anyhow, despite the Red Stockings' close connection with the revolutionary left at the time, they pursued their course together with the women union leaders. And by June 1975, they managed to pursue the largest women's organizations in the country that together represented around 30,000 women to unite their powers, to organize and agitate for a one-day women's strike. Change slide. Thank you. These different women's organizations had by that time already got together to plan activities. Next slide. Thank you. These different women's organizations had by that time already got together to plan activities on the United Nations Women's Year. And the Red Stockings had representatives in these meetings and promoted the idea of a one-day women's strike. But it was first met with skepticism. But they continued to bring up the idea. But finally, when somebody suggested to call it a day off instead of a strike, the attitude changed to a more positive direction. A day off was less threatening and not so immediately connected to the left and class conflicts. Thus, now the actions had a very broad support of various women's organizations that counted around 50, representing everything from labor unions to charity organizations, covering the political spectrum from left to the right. And that support, combined with extensive planning and promotion by the organizers, is probably the key to the huge success in participation in the Women's Day Off. And as I probably mentioned before, it is often mentioned that around 90% of women in the country supported it and participated in one way or the other. And the manifestation meeting held in downtown Reykjavik during the day is still among the greatest or the largest manifestation meetings or political gatherings in Icelandic history as of today. And the organizers, they worked very hard to promote the idea on many levels. And with extensive lobbying, they got the support of all the largest trade unions and the political parties. And they also went directly to workplaces to agitate for the idea among women workers. And strictly speaking, it would be an illegal strike. And however, the fact that the organizers managed to get the popular opinion on their side and promote it as this great historic happening, which would in any case only last for one single day, most employers went along with the idea, and some even gave women the day off, actually gave them the day off, so they weren't striking, but somewhat perhaps making it less threatening. But the actions had two primary aims. Change slide. Thank you. Firstly, to demand recognition of women's essential contribution to society and highlight the unfairness in how women's work in general was rewarded in terms of low wages and lack of respect. And secondly, to show solidarity with the world's women, especially those in less well-off countries, on the occasion of the United Nations Women's Year. It depended somewhat on the ideological position of the speaker, what aim was emphasized. Furthermore, the Red Stockings and the leftist newspapers always referred to the action as a strike, highlighting the class aspects of the women's struggle, while both organizers and media from the liberal and conservative ends referred to it as a day off and highlighted the joyous, positive, and moderate atmosphere. And some of the arguments, and I'm not sure, this is a flyer that was distributed by the organizers, which had some points with arguments, which were the following. I think it's interesting to hear them from a little bit historical perspective. But the arguments were that Women's Day Off, why a Women's Day Off? Firstly, because when employers are advertising for an opening for a low paid and low respected job, they particularly ask for a woman. Because the median wages for women in trade and office job is only 73% of that of men in the same branch. Because there are no women in the negotiation committees of the central organization of the trade unions. Because the median wages for women workers are approximately 30,000 kronas less than that of men workers. Because farming women are not members of the Farmers Association because they are seen as farmers' wives and not workers of their own, in their own right. Because it is often said about women who work as housewives, oh, she does nothing, she's just at home. Because there are men with power in this society who claim that more daycare places for children would only contribute to women's laziness. Because the sex of the applicant is usually a more decisive factor than education and merits in questions of hiring or promotion. And because women's experiences of housework is not valued at all in the labor market. So the Women's Day Off in 1975 has gone down in history as a remarkable event. Yeah, thank you. An example of women's solidarity traversing socioeconomic classes and reflecting the political spectrum from right to left. The actions are frequently mentioned as an essential part of the success story regarding the development towards increased gender equality in Iceland, which has, together with the other Nordic countries, frequently topped international indexes and lists of gender equality the last decades. The actions have been repeated 5 times in Iceland of which the last took place in 2018. And these repetitions have been used to raise consciousness about gender equality and put feminism and equality on the public agenda. And as such, they have reflected the dominant feminist and gender equality discourses of the time. And lastly, the so-called Icelandic Women strike has been mentioned as inspiration for similar actions in other countries, among others in Holland in 1981, Switzerland in 1991, Germany in 1994, Japan in 1997, and most recently in Poland in 2016, which in turn inspired the global movement for women's strike. The fact that the Women's Day Off managed to unite so many women in solidarity with each other has gained almost a mythical aura. Nevertheless, with a symbolic strike like this, the question whether it was successful or not is complex, and it is difficult to measure its direct effects. The primary aim was to raise consciousness and not to demand something specific from a particular employer. However, the success undoubtedly lies in the huge amount of participation. But the question remains whether the success in participation somewhat has blunted its critical edge. At least some of the original agitators for the idea, coming from the Red Stocking movements, felt that in the end, the day became little more than a celebration, toothless celebration of women. Yes, only to conclude that together these two strikes, we think they, if looked at together, contrasted with each other, they highlight some of the interesting intersections between class and gender and the irresolvableness of these two categories and the conflicts that arise. Thank you. I will finish here.
Thank you very much, Vala and Eva. Just to wrap up a little bit here with all the ideas that have come up, and just to say that it's been quite interesting to see, and maybe this has been one of the differences throughout the different talks, that you guys have situated the female worker very much in the center of a class struggle, and not just in the center, but actually sometimes like leading that very struggle. So I think that there are very interesting ideas going through the different interventions. I'm going to just say here we have one question from Ella it was from Ella for you guys, Eva and Vala. I have a couple questions more, but I just want to remind everybody that now is the moment to add more questions to the chat, and we are gonna share them here. Let's start with Ella's question. I'm gonna read it. Ella asks, very interesting that some employers supported the strike and agreed women a day off. Did they also make any commitment to raise wages? Vala and Eva, this is for you guys.
If you're talking about the Icelandic Women's Day Off, then no. So the support was very weak, I guess, and like I ended, it's very difficult to measure the concrete effects of the strike because no such demands were met.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions for for everybody, but maybe I will start with one that is for you, Ella and Desiree. As I've said, Vala and Eva has situated like the female worker very much in the center of this ongoing theme in all these presentations of yours, that is some kind of community action against more institutionalized forms of class struggles, let's say. I think that this is one of these kind of leitmotifs that has gone through all the presentations. I wonder if Ella and Desiree, you could develop a little more about the female workers' position within the case study that you guys have presented?
Yeah, a couple of things. Yeah, obviously, also like the cleaning workforce it's largely female, and this has also shaped the campaigns against outsourcing. Like informants often talk about like how women are leading the movements and that women are like at the forefront, also like at the demonstrations, and also like, yeah, taking the lead and being less afraid than the men. Somehow, also like in the campaigns, questions about both like racist and also sexist harassment in the workplace are like kind of centered as workplace grievances, which is like, yeah, so actively having like, yeah, doing those are like issues that are focused on and seen as union issues for unions. Yeah, and it's also like in a situation of outsourcing, like that's there's a lot of harassment, sexual harassment cases from like managers from the subcontracting companies towards women workers, and that they often go like unnoticed. And informants also talk about like how like that the universities and other institutions that are like hiring these contractors are washing kind of their hands, like by using an outsourcing company, they can like shut the issue down kind of and not take any responsibility, even though it's happening on their premises.
So this hospital protest, I think one of the interesting things is that the cutback never dealt with in this way of women as a, I mean, the hospital as a women workplace for a lot of women. It was sometimes it was the issue of cutbacks at the delivery ward was raised as an issue of there was a attempt to raise the issue of women's healthcare, but mostly it was framed in as of a nuclear family. In that role was not discussed in a way of women workers, both as nurses or as medical doctors in the hospital. And I mean, nursing, for example, is a very gender segregated profession in Sweden. I think 95% are women or something like this. So, but this was never really raised to the other presentations or ideas with the cooperatives, is that, I mean, the cooperatives sort of take over part of the work that the welfare state has previously performed, and they in that I mean, so in that sense, the cooperatives are relegated to women in the home or another institution. So this makes like sort of the rural citizen, places the rural citizen in the role that women has usually had. In cities, people don't have to take up this care work, but in these countryside locations, people have to come together and perform reproductive work. Yeah, but not necessarily the women in the countryside. There was also men that I interviewed, so it was a bit of a twist on that usually quite sedimented division of labor. So
Great, thank you. I think that we might be having some connection problems with your call, but I think that we did get the gist of what you said, which I think is very interesting. You brought some very interesting ideas to the table.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No worries, it's fine. It's things of live streaming sessions. Okay, again, please do write questions in the chat. I have infinite questions, I have to say, so I will just go with the next one. If you guys have any question for each other, very much like Ella, do ask. Another idea that I think has been talked about mainly by Ella has been the role of emotions in these struggles. I wonder, not maybe very deeply, but I wonder if Vala and Eva and Desirée, you're able to maybe spot some kind of central emotions or central emotions that crossed these kind of struggles that you spoke about. Maybe Eva and Vala, you start responding, and then Desirée, you take over.
Well, of course, I mean, of course, there were lots of emotions. I remember I interviewed one of them. I wrote about this cleaner strike in my dissertation on the women's movement, and while doing that, I made interviews with the cleaners in Borlänge and up in North and in Umeå. But of course, that was 20 years later. But it was apparent, I mean, from when the cleaner strike broke out in Borlänge, I said it became a lot of stress also for the cleaners. I mean, they were expected to be, well, not silenced, but they were expected to keep to a more traditional role, that they should not struggle and so on. But though they got immediate support from the steelworkers, but at the same time, some of them found it very hard. And but I think the importance was that these cleaners, they organized themselves in not only in the union club, but at the meetings. They really supported each other, so that everybody would feel that it was important to keep on the strikes. And other aspects of the emotions, I mean, it depends really how you should, what that concept really is. But I think one important experience from these strikes where, for example, the cleaners up in North told me, I mean, during the strike, it was the first time ever they left their town, and suddenly they went down, took the train, went down and joined big meetings, and they went up and talked, and were main speakers and talked for all these cleaners' rights. So of course there were lots of emotions involved in this strike. Thanks.
Yeah, this is a good question, and I thought actually both of your presentations, Desirée and Ella's, were very thought-provoking, and your discussions about the emotions in political activism, and it was a really interesting talk and connected to much of my interests. And I have the things that comes up in this material, in these narratives now, where I am mostly working then with historical materials. I'm working with text, but I've been looking at like the kind of I often read the descriptions of consciousness raising and feelings of or like solidarity. Of course, it's a decision to show solidarity. It's also an expression of a political conviction, in a way, a stance, but it's also an emotional process, and you can see that in these narratives of the activists, both when they described their these actions and the organization and everything around these actions later in their own like when in interviews or like autobiographical texts that are written later, but also at the same time. But one other thing that perhaps relates to this and this talk about emotions is also how, for example, this large event like this Women's Day Off in Iceland became. And like I was talking about, depending on your ideological stand, you or people highlighted and described the actions in a different way. They used different words and so on. And a lot of the things that was perhaps or was used in the media, then particularly the conservative and liberal media, was to kind of make it less threatening by making it humorous. And the media covering of the event was much about like a little bit funny interviews with dads who had to buy sausages for their kids during that day. Sausages sold out in Reykjavik, or like some kind of simple food, or and pictures from banks where the bank directives had to wash their own dishes. So much was done to kind of like make it funny and then less threatening in a way. And it was a one day only funny, highlights the gender segregation of how we do work. And then to connect to your former question about the effect where the demands met and so on. And then the day after, well, back to business as usual and gender segregated workplaces and so on. But yeah.
Yeah, okay, so in my case, yeah, there was of course a lot of emotions. I didn't focus so much on them, but I think there was like one very strong emotion of not being seen, or of the countryside being like ignored or left behind. And in the early protests around the hospital, people were very upset that they didn't receive any media coverage, because there was, for these areas, it was a lot of people, and then they were saying this, if this would have been in Stockholm, it would be on all the national media and all the national news. But now we're here, and what do we need to do to get the attention of people? We have actually life-threatening problems here, but no one like hears us. So there was something with this like being heard or being ignored, and then and I think that changed with the occupation, because with the occupation, then media came, and it was such an exotic event, and there was a lot of politicians going there, and there was a lot of media, different types of celebrities, musicians, and other media personalities going there. So that was sort of a reivindication that now we're actually being seen, and now we can actually speak out or something. But the first year or two was a lot of like, no one hears us, no one sees us, we cannot break out of this like media radio shadow or something. And there was also a lot of I don't know if that's emotional, but there was I mean, to some extent, they often had to travel to Stockholm to talk to politicians and stuff. So while people were coming to the occupation, there was also a lot of people going to Stockholm to actually raise the issue. So there was like these movements across space to actually make sure that there was that it was recognized, or that they were heard. So I think this being a citizen but not being heard, that was quite a strong emotion, that we are paying taxes here. We are also contributing equally much, or maybe even more than people in the capital, but we're still not heard, and we don't get anything back, sort of. That was the very strong feeling that came through in a lot of different ways.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, now I'm going to read the question that you yourself, Desirée, just posted for for Vala. Desirée, you're wondering about the connections from the Women's Day of in Iceland and today's calls for women's strike on 8th March. Could you elaborate on that a bit, Vala?
Yeah, well, somehow the Icelandic women's strike it got quite a lot of publicity when it took place in '75, and then it has been repeated in when was it, 2005, 2010, 2016, and 2018, and 85 as well. So so somehow women's groups around the world have gotten the smell of it, or news about it, and in Poland in 2016 it was perhaps it's more noticeable for somebody coming from Iceland that notices, oh, they're mentioning our strike, but they in Poland in 2016, and when Polish women stormed the street on what has been called the Black Monday to protest the restrictions of abortion rights, then they frequently referred to referred to the Icelandic women's strike as a source of inspiration for their action. A little bit the same way as Eva talked about before, that these cleaners in Sweden had referred to strikers or cleaners in Norway and the UK, like, if they can, we can. And it has been written about and have been, it's become a little bit of a flying, I wouldn't say myth, but it's kind of political myth that creates this kind of idea about a great solidarity among women, and the number 90% of women supported it is often mentioned, and then it's often a little bit exaggerated. The effects of the strike is a little bit exaggerated because, for example, in Icelandic history, that it's connected, the first gender equality laws that were accepted in '76 are sometimes connected to it as a effect or something, but that's not. It would be a really big simplification. But anyway, also this '75 strike has come up.
I'm sorry, Vala. I'm sorry I'm stopping you here. I think that this is a good moment to stop this answer, because I think that it's a good rounding idea for the panel that we've had today. Thank you, all of you, for participating with your ideas. In 2 minutes, we'll be kicked out from this panel, and that's why I'm just taking this moment to just close it. Thank you, everybody in the audience. Thank you especially Vala, Ella, Desirée, and Eva. It's been wonderful, and see you around in the Marxist feminist struggle.